First up is a new film called May December. It stars Natalie Portman, Julianne Moore, and Charles Melton. And Julianne Moore and Charles Melton's character are, well, they're basically like a Mary Kay Letourneau situation where the woman is much, much older and gets involved in a, relationship with a younger man. And so the film takes place centering around, they have twins who are graduating high school, which is such a disturbing thought because we find out that Charles Melton's character is like 36, which, woof. Anyway, so Natalie Portman plays an actress in this who is going to be portraying a version of the Julianne Moore character in a, biopic-esque thing. And, this is definitely like a gimme an Oscar film. And Natalie Portman and Julianne Moore both have Oscars, I'd like to point out. Charles Melton is actually the one I walked away from this film being like, damn, that dude really stole the show, which was very surprising for this. And that's not to say that Natalie Portman and Julianne Moore do not give excellent performances, but for whatever reason, this film did not sort of rise to the potential I feel like it had. I think part of it comes from, anytime there's a film about the making of a film or a film that, a character is an actress trying to study a thing, I at least find that I get a little turned off by it because it feels very capital A acting. And, I'm sure it's very fun for performers to play because it lets them sort of show their process as a part of the performance. But I find it a little overdramatic. And so I think, you watch Natalie Portman try and take on Julianne Moore's mannerisms and Julianne Moore's character. She has a very specific speech pattern that is very hyperbolic. And, I was fine watching the two of them. But then Charles Melton, who plays basically, he is a victim of grooming and all this other stuff. He's so good in this, dealing with the reckoning of, oh my God, I'm going to be an empty nester at 36. This Natalie Portman's character is about the same age as him and comes in and sort of changes his view on things. And I think causes his character to question really, truly for the first time, what he has been involved in. So there are some spectacular moments in this, but if you, tell me who's in it and you tell me the premise, I expect, top tier stuff out of you. It's from director Todd Haynes, who has also done some really great work. He directed Carol, he directed Far From Heaven, Velvet Goldmine. He knows how to direct performances, but his latest stuff I'm not as into. Wonderstruck and Dark Waters were fine. They were whatever. Anyway, so should you see this movie? I think because, it doesn't hurt that it's out on Netflix, and if you already have Netflix, you're fine. It's definitely going to be uncomfortable at points, just given the subject matter. The other thing is, I don't think it treads into salacious territory. Well, there are some points where it does. I think it does a decent job of trying not to judge the characters too much, but sometimes it's just hard to watch. And, again, Charles Melton, great performance, rooting for him the whole time. Julianne Moore and Natalie Portman, I think because of who their characters are, I was less inclined to. But overall, I think it's a perfectly fine watch. I don't know if it's going to win the awards that it's set out to probably win. And not that anybody makes a film being like, I'm only doing this for the awards, but you can tell when a film is gimme, gimme. But still, thought it was well done, solid. It just didn't quite live up to what I was potentially expecting from it, given who was involved. So I'm going to give it a 3.7 out of 5. Next up is a film called Silent Night, and it is from director John Woo, who I'm a huge fan of. I don't think anybody does action like John Woo. You probably best know him from Face Off. And this is a film that I think only a John Woo could do. Basically, nobody talks in it, which is pretty impressive. It's all told through action, but there are some pretty emotional moments in it that I was not expecting to be as emotional as they were. It stars Joel Kinnaman, and his character, unfortunately, he has a son who is the victim of basically a gang is in a shootout. His son is a victim of a stray bullet, and he decides to take revenge on the gangs who are responsible. But I think he actually does some pretty good, capital A acting, as I call it, in terms of dealing with the grief. Catalina Sandino Moreno plays his wife, and you get to see how this horrible incident impacts their relationship. And then we get into the very action-y part where, he decides to take revenge. And so he starts training and using YouTube videos to learn how to become a fighter, etc. Look, it's a movie, whatever. Some of the producers are the folks who are behind the John Wick team, and you can definitely feel the sort of Wick-Woo synergy through a lot of the action sequences. But again, I was really impressed that it held my attention. It's only an hour and 43 minutes, but, to do a movie with no dialogue in 2023, or pretty much no dialogue in 2023, I think is really impressive. And it's a bold move. And, The action itself is good. The premise, it also, I should note, this takes place all around Christmas because, the son is murdered on Christmas, tiny spoiler, but not. And so he gives himself like a year to do this revenge thing. But yeah, that some of that stuff is a little cheese. Let's not lie here. I think in terms of John Woo's work, it's not the most original of what we've seen, but it is still a culmination of, his best moves. The other person who's in it is Kid Cudi, which I didn't recognize him at first. He plays a detective who is in like the gang unit, etc. He's fine, he also doesn't talk pretty much. So, if you are a John Woo fan, if you like John Wick as well. And I will acknowledge this is not quite John Wick levels of quality. And like I said, it's not even John Woo's best, but it's still, if you like this genre, like you're going to have a decent time. You just have to sort of roll with the punches and suspend your disbelief and just be like, yeah, all right, this is going to be an action movie. Cool. And the action, for the most part, feels practical, and like the car chases and all that stuff. I don't feel like I'm watching like a huge CG fight, which is kind of refreshing also, in addition to the choosing not to have a ton of reliance on dialogue in a heavy action film. Like I was like, yeah, all right, I'm into it. So overall, again, I'm not going to try and convince anybody who's not interested in seeing a bunch of violence to see this film. And that's not normally necessarily my cup of tea anyway, but I think if anybody can get me to go, it's John Woo. But overall, I'm going to give it a 3.3 out of 5. The last film I have this week is called Eileen, and it stars Anne Hathaway, Thomasin McKenzie, and Shea Whigham, and this is apparently based on a book. I am not familiar with the book, so I can't speak to how it is as an adaptation, but Thomasin McKenzie plays this woman called Eileen. She works in a prison, basically. Her dad is a former cop who is, he's just an alcoholic at this point. I hope that's not a huge spoiler. I think it's in the trailers. And then at this prison, Anne Hathaway's character shows up as, she's a psychologist, one of the two. And she is, this glamorous presence. I want to say they're in Boston. I think they're in Boston. They're somewhere on the East Coast. And it's a smaller town, and, suddenly this, quote, cultured person who was in New York, and I think she goes to Harvard at some point, shows up, and just Thomasin McKenzie's character, Eileen, is mind blown by it. I think Thomasin McKenzie is a great actress. She is from Jojo Rabbit, which I thought she was just, truly spectacular in. She's in Power of the Dog, Last Night in Soho. I have been pretty vocal. I'm not a huge Anne Hathaway fan. I thought she was fine in this. She also has sort of limited screen time, but she kept just doing like 5 different accents throughout this film. It was like New York, because the character went to school in New York, and then Boston or Harvard, and then, like the mid-Atlantic, just sort of old-timey. I should note this is a period piece. I want to say it takes place in like the 50s or 60s or something along those lines. Yeah, but I like the dynamic between them. I like the way Thomasin McKenzie plays this admiring like character who has been sort of constrained by, just being stuck in her hometown, stuck with this challenging family member, not being able to break free, but having potential, and her getting to see what it looks like for somebody who has done all these things that she is like unfulfilled on to come into her life. But then the film certainly takes a twist. I would say like 2/3 of the way through that I was not expecting. I am not going to spoil it for you, but I suddenly perked up and I was like, oh my God, what is happening here? So, it's not a completely unfounded twist, but it did feel like we did not lay quite enough groundwork for it, but I was willing to run with it. It's only an hour and a half movie, so, an hour in, something changes a bit. But for Thomasin McKenzie and Shea Whigham's performances alone, I think as we're seeing, I should also shout out Maren Ireland, who plays the mother of one of the prisoners. I think I just want to acknowledge that this like film has been positioned in what feels like a little bit of a queer baity way. And similar to sort of May-December, where I feel like people assume the May-December relationship is a romantic relationship between Natalie Portman and Julianne Moore. And I feel like it's more referring to the romantic part is Julianne Moore and Charles Melton. But there's also sort of like, Natalie Portman is a younger platonic woman in Julianne Moore's life. So it's applicable to both sides of those relationships. But anyway, I just want to like warn folks up front. This is not necessarily in that realm of film, but for better or for worse. But Thomasin McKenzie alone, I think, is worth seeing this for. So I am also going to give this a 3.7 out of 5.